I should begin by saying, since Rob asked me to say something nice about his presentation, it was very nice. Okay, so I've done my duty, right? Okay, now, so let me move on to what I'm here for today, which is to draw some parallels between the events that we're observing in the Middle East today and Eastern Europe in the late 1980s and more recently in the 2000s. And I claim no expertise on the Middle East, but some of the factors, I'll highlight some of the factors that scholars of Eastern Europe have identified when explaining both the collapse of the authoritarian regime, so why some regimes would collapse and some might not, and also what would happen afterwards, right? Which countries end up being democracies and which might not. So I'm going to sort of try to draw parallels, and then Professor Mufti can tell me how my parallels are wrong and it's all different in the Middle East. Right. As far as Eastern Europe, right, so we are basically talking here about two, what we could say, revolutionary situations that existed in the region in the past 20 years that are similar, arguably, to the ones we're observing now in the Middle East. The first situation is obviously 1989, when communist regimes crumbled across Eastern Europe and subsequently also in the Soviet Union. And more recently, in the early 2000s, we saw autocratic regimes fall as a result of the so-called colored revolutions or electoral revolutions in places such as Serbia, Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan, right? So we have sort of these so-called velvet revolutions of 1989, and then subsequently electoral or colored revolutions of the early 2000s. And I would suggest that if we sort of look at these events in Eastern Europe and try to extrapolate on the situation today in the Middle East, that the experience of Eastern Europe provides both reasons for short-term optimism, as far as actually seeing autocratic regimes crumble, but also for medium-term pessimism when it comes to the likelihood of democracy being established in the short to medium term in the region. So let me talk about these two things. I'll first talk about comparisons on these two issues, causes and likelihoods of regime collapse, autocratic regime collapsing, and then the likelihoods of democracy actually being established, right? For the causes and likelihoods of regime collapse or regime survival, events that unfold in the Middle East today share some important similarities, I would argue, with the events of Eastern Europe in 1989 and also more recently. One such similarity, perhaps most obviously, is that events in Eastern Europe show us how long-established authoritarian regimes can collapse very quickly. Nobody really predicted or expected the Soviet Union to disintegrate and communist rule be wiped out in Eastern Europe over such a short period of time, and yet this happened, right? Similarly, when we're talking about the Middle East, maybe even just a few months ago, not many people expected regimes in places like Egypt to fall, and yet here we are, right? So if you didn't predict collapse of regimes in Tunisia and Egypt, don't feel bad because you're not alone. A lot of books subsequently have been written explaining how it was all inevitable that, of course, communism was going to collapse, but, at the same time, weeks, sometimes months before it actually happened, people were saying, no way, anything like this is going to happen, right? So, okay, so another similarity we can say between these two regions, both regions show how collapse of authoritarian regime in one country could have enormous impact on stability of the region as a whole, or on stability of the nearby regimes. It could motivate activists to take risks that they couldn't maybe seem unthinkable, and scholars have come up with this term snowballing, kind of the snowballing of revolutionary changes, right, of regime collapse. Again, going to Eastern Europe, one scholar sort of very eloquently described what happened in 1989 as this sort of snowball effect. He actually didn't use the term snowball, but he used figure 10 very, I think, ingeniously. He said it took 10 years for regime to collapse in Poland, 10 months in Hungary, 10 weeks in Eastern Germany, 10 days in Czechoslovakia, and 10 days in Romania. Oh, sorry, 10 hours in Romania, right? So it was 10 days in Czechoslovakia, right? Okay, so now one could say that maybe Middle East, in fact, is even a better example of the snowballing than Eastern Europe was in the 1989, because we could clearly say that collapse of communism in countries such as, say, Bulgaria or Czechoslovakia had as much, if not more, to do with the fact that Gorbachev, a leader of the Soviet Union at the time, decided to withdraw Soviet support from these regimes, right? So one could say that sort of democratic movement in Poland had less to do with collapse of communism in Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia than the fact that Gorbachev withdrew his support. Now, in Egypt, events were precipitated right, by the example of in Tunisia, right, relatively strategically minor country, and now we see this protest spreading to other countries in the region. So it wasn't the withdrawal of external support for authoritarian rule, but really the snowballing effect that we have observed. Now, that said, this learning goes both ways, right? So activists learn from the success of activists, pro-democracy activists in other countries, but also autocrats can learn. And we see this happening in Eastern Europe, where autocrats learn to do things such as create, for example, pro-government youth organizations, as was done in Russia, sort of looking at the role pro-democracy youth organizations played in the events in Ukrainian and, say, Serbian colored revolutions, right? In the Middle East, we now, this sort of, the cutting off of the internet and Twitter and so forth, right? So it's not just the activists, pro-democracy activists learn, but autocrats could learn as well. So again, when we're talking about likelihood of regime collapse, maybe something to keep in mind, right? Now, talking sort of this, another third similarity, the popular protests, right? So the prominence of popular protests, one could say, is another similarity between these two regions, right? But then again, if we actually look at the more closely at the experience of Eastern Europe, I would say that we should be cautious when linking the likelihood of regime collapse to the size of these popular protests, right? So it's not just a simple relationship that people take to the streets, and therefore, the more people take to the streets, the more likely a regime is going to collapse, right? On the one hand, sure, I mean, we could say maybe popular protest is a necessary condition. We see this dramatic shifts in power in both regions, in Eastern Europe and now in the Middle East, because the public, which has been oppressed and sort of fed up with oppression for years, accumulated grievances, and finally suddenly realizes it has this ability to protest against authoritarian rule. Now, but on the other hand, if we actually look at cases when authoritarian regimes collapsed in Eastern Europe, there is not always a clear relationship between how big the protests were and how likely these regimes were to collapse. We certainly see examples of large protests toppling autocratic regimes, as was the case in Ukraine in 2004, but we also see large protests not toppling the regimes, as was the case, for example, in Serbia in the mid-1990s, so before Milosevic would fall in 2000, there were large protests, sustained protests several years prior that didn't lead to the collapse of the regime. By the same token, sometimes collapse of the regime followed relatively small protests, as was the case in Georgia and Kyrgyzstan in the region, right? So again, so this relationship between popular protests and the survival of the regime is not necessarily kind of unidirectional. Now, so if we were to hypothesize, I would say, about the likelihood of regime survival, I would say that in addition to protests, we should pay particular attention to several other factors, and one particularly important factor is the internal cohesion of the regime, right? And again, on this dimension, how cohesive the regime is. Eastern Europe has some lessons, arguably, to offer, or at least to think about when we're now looking at the developments in the Middle East. Now, it seems to be that regimes that fell in the Middle East so far, such as regimes in Egypt and Tunisia, exhibited some of the same elements that characterized failed authoritarian regimes in Eastern Europe. In particular, we have seen the split in the coercive apparatus. Especially in the military, right? So the military indicates that it would not violently suppress the protesters, right? So again, we see this happened in Serbia, in Georgia, in Ukraine, in the early 2000s, right? And again in Egypt and Tunisia these days, right? So simultaneously, another sort of feature of the regime, what kind of makes the regime more or less cohesive, is to what extent the regime relies or sort of is based on an ideologically driven revolutionary elite, right? So is the old regime primarily relies on patronage and maybe some sort of coercion to sustain itself in power, or is it also underpinned by some coherent ideology, right? And again, here we have quite a difference, both in Eastern Europe and I would argue perhaps now in the Middle East as well, right? So the regimes that fell, such as Mubarak's regime in Egypt, right, and also in Tunisia, were arguably held together largely by patronage. There wasn't sort of this strong underlying ideology, which is very different in, say, a place like Iran, where we didn't see the collapse of the regime. In Libya now, maybe again, Professor Mafti will correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say sort of it seems it's more ideologically cohesive there, right? Cuba could be cited another example, right, of an autocratic regime that, if the experience of Eastern Europe teaches us anything, these regimes, we could say, could be more stable, precisely. Moving on, right, to the last, the second point, the likelihood of democracy taking root in the region. Again, drawing on the parallels of Eastern Europe, just very briefly, I'll mention this particular importance of three factors. Again, ideology, leadership, and the role of the West, right? And here, I'm going to talk about ideology a little bit differently, and I talk fast, I'll manage in 2 minutes, right? Okay. So one way ideology matters in Eastern Europe, and this is maybe echoes some things that Professor Devine was saying earlier, is that there has been a monopoly of liberal democratic ideology in Eastern Europe in 1989, to the point that it was really the only game in town. Communism, the ideology of socialism, which was sort of this new game in town and maybe the only game in town in, say, Russia in 1917, there was a complete reversal by the late 1980s. This ideology was completely discredited among the larger parts of the population, and really the opposition spoke this united language of liberal democracy. Again, in the Middle East, the story is more complicated. Now, another difference, and again, what made democracy more or less likely to take root in Eastern Europe was the lack of clear leadership, right? So again, in Eastern Europe, especially these more recent electoral revolutions of 2000s, we saw opposition characterized by strong organization. They had months to prepare. These revolutions took place at the time of regularly scheduled elections. Very different situation in the Middle East, right? The events were much more spontaneous. There was much less organization. So again, you could speculate what the outcomes of this would be. Again, if Eastern Europe teaches us anything, I would say the prospect for democracy is less likely under these spontaneous conditions and organized opposition. Why? Primarily because it would be easier for the old elites and old institutions to kind of recreate themselves in the new environment. Now, finally, the third sort of important difference and the third factor that I would say affects whether or not democracy will take root is the role of the West, right? Whether or not liberal democracy would triumph, what Eastern Europe teaches us is that the role of external factors and actors is very important. Arguably, a country such as Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Slovakia would not have become democracies as they are now without the strong pro-democracy pressure from the European Union, right? So this incentive of membership, conditionality, democratic conditionality, and really if we look at the region, with the possible exception of Mongolia, the only countries that become democratic in Eastern European region are the ones which actually was this incentive for democracy coming from the EU, with the carrot being membership in the EU, right? There is nothing, there is no EU or similar international institution in the Middle East. And again, as Professor Mufti was saying, the role of the US here one might want to think how that might play in. Thank you.